Hey guys, and welcome to this stream on Churchill. I'm gonna do with my guest Dominus here. How are you doing, Dominus?
I'm doing fantastically, yes. And today we're going to discuss, um, principally Andrew Roberts's biography of Churchill. But I mean, we will, I suppose, get into. I think you wanted to discuss some of the other uh, biographies of the past and how this fits into the narrative of the biography itself, perhaps at the beginning.
Yeah, so I think it's important to say when we were going to discuss his life, we're going to basically go through it in chronological order, kind of how Roberts takes you. It used Andrew Roberts's book basically as the guide, and then that led into this idea of, well, I remember when it came out that Peter Hitchens was basically giving out. I think it was around the same time he was releasing his Phony Victory book, in which he says basically the myth the British created around the Second World War victory was a phony victory, and it was in a critique of. It was in that sort of ballpark, that sort of mindset that Hitchens then sort of attacked Roberts for releasing what Hitchens deemed yet another Churchill biography, as if we were all sick of them. So that kind of. Right. It was interesting that we had both picked up this anyway, this biography by Roberts, and had been intrigued enough. And we were both of a certain generation where perhaps we weren't inundated with these biographies that seemed to be in Hitchens's mind. So I think we were discussing simply, was this a biography that felt like a stuffed, yet another one? For me, I don't think it was. It felt quite fresh to be able to walk into a bookstore and see this big one-volume catch-all biography that you could go to, almost like a reference for the man himself. Whereas before that, I think, if you saw a new Churchill thing, it was always like Churchill and this and Churchill or that. It was not. There was still a gap, I think, for something definitive, certainly for my age group. The only other one we could think of that was like this was Roy Jenkins's one, but I think enough time had passed since that had come out that it doesn't feel like a stuffed market.
I think that so there was Roy Jenkins, and there was of course Sir Martin Gilbert's official definitive biography, which is several volumes, and that one's huge. But yes, in this generation, when you say that there were many books with Churchill and someone else, I think Roberts himself actually released a book. He released a few different books that included Churchill in the title, but he hadn't. But you're right, a biography of a full-length biography of this scale had not been done, and so I mean, I always thought Peter Hitchens was a bit curmudgeonly. I respect him. I do prefer his late brother, but Peter Hitchens is an interesting journalist, but I disagree, as you do, with his assertion that this was unnecessary. I think it was absolutely necessary, especially as the narrative around Churchill seems to be being poisoned by certain political elements. I think this was a necessary addition to the modern conversation.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm trying to remember. Yeah, did he have a Churchill and Stalin? I do remember he had some of those other ones, Roberts. I haven't read any of them, but it makes sense then why he was able to spit this out so quickly on the back of his Napoleon biography, because he basically had so much of the notes already hanging around from all these other books. I think it's probably quite easy for him to stitch it all together. Though he does try to have the selling point, doesn't he, in his interviews around it, Roberts, where he says he has the access to the king's diaries and stuff, which in fairness I think he does use in the second part of the book, which we mightn't get to tonight. I think we're going to try split this up a little bit just to give us enough time so we're not racing through the life and glossing over some points people might then think shouldn't be glossed over.
Right. So Roberts there was a book, 2003, Hitler and Churchill. There was 1994, Eminent Churchillians. There was 2019, actually, Leadership in War, which is after the biography, Essential Lessons from Those Who Made, I can't remember the full title, but that was also included information of Churchill, and then Masters and Commanders, how Roosevelt, Churchill, Marshall, and Marshall won the war.
Yes, that's because I couldn't remember. Did he do Roosevelt and Churchill or Hitler and Churchill? He'd done both. Okay.
He did, yeah.
Yeah. So it's also, he chose the subtitle "Walking with Destiny," which he takes from, I think he gives it to us straight away early on. I can get it up here in his preface. So that comes from a quote where, in retrospect, Churchill was recalling it. So, he had time to muse on this, but it says, recalling the evening of Friday, 10th of May, 1940, when he had become prime minister only hours after Adolf Hitler had unleashed the blitzkrieg on the West, Churchill wrote, I felt as if I were walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And so that seemed to be the quote that Roberts took to go, okay, that's kind of how I'm going to frame the book. And then he splits the book into two parts, one preparation, the other the trial.
Yes.
How did you think about that way that he decided to do it? For me, it's probably a little bit World War II heavy, but we've just talked about Roberts's previous material. He's fascinated by it, and it's probably what he lent himself to. Like, I think there's loads in Churchill's life, even before you get to World War II, which is sort of definitely worthy. Like, I loved reading preparation, and for some of the trial parts, I was just like, it's a bit military history for me. This,
Yeah. Well, I thought, the way that he divided the book, I suppose it wasn't something that would be unforeseen. It was a little bit like, I mean, this is how historians have seen his life, if not articulated explicitly the way he's done it. They've sort of that's how his life has been seen pre-World War II, and then the moment in 1940 when he's elevated to the premiership in this stage. So I don't think that Roberts came up with a novel idea here, but he did sort of, I think his delineation in the context, or sorry, his division in the context of his own work, as well as I think in the context of Churchill's life, made sense. I don't think it was nonsensical, and I thought the "Walking with Destiny" quote was very, it was very stirring, and I thought it was.
He twins it back to a schoolboy quote, doesn't he? Where Churchill feels he is destined to save the empire in this moment. He's meant to like said it to a schoolboy. I think it is actually corroborated enough that it wasn't just made up nonsense.
No. When he was 17, he said, I think he said to his friend, he said, I feel. I mean, it's a paraphrase, but essentially what he said was that, I feel that there's a great, war coming, and that it'll be my duty to save London and to save the empire. And this is, by the way, Churchill's incredible prescience and ability to foresee the future. I think this is something we might also get into in the stream. But yes, I mean, this sense of, I think Andrew Roberts puts it, of destiny, winged destiny sort of fluttering above his head. This was a sense that Churchill had of himself. So it's a way not only, I think, to summarize sort of Churchill as he appears to other people, but Churchill as he conceived.
And I think it's because of that 17-year-old quote, which is why I kind of will give Roberts this framing, because it is actually how Churchill genuinely went through his life and lived it with this sense of destiny. It's not something that has only come after the fact, which makes it really interesting when you're reading his events in preparation, like that he's obsessed with this. So I suppose then we can start at, I liked the start of it, when Roberts doesn't shy away from the just how aristocratic Churchill was. He was, born in a palace, born in Blenheim Palace, and born into the Churchills, or the Duke of Marlborough dynasty, though not the main line. And his father, of course, Randolph, was already an eminent politician for the Tories, and he basically doesn't shy away from the fact that because of he's truly an aristocrat, because of this inheritance, he does see himself, even when he enters politics, in this mode of noblesse oblige, which sometimes a writer of Churchill, even if you're going for, from where Roberts is going, if you're trying to sell Churchill to an American audience, or any of the more liberal version of Churchill, people do kind of shy away from that because they're afraid to state just how much he viewed himself as being in a class which was born and bred for guiding and governing.
Well,
I don't know what you thought about that start where he says like Churchill saw himself in the mold of noblesse oblige.
I think that
I find it quite refreshing.
I think that it would have been disingenuous to shy away from it, and I think that it was refreshing, and it was excellent that Roberts emphasized this. Not only did he point it out, but he emphasized it, and not only at the beginning, but you can see that current sort of or undercurrent running throughout Churchill's life and throughout Roberts's book. I think that personally, I don't want to get into it much, but I think that the instinct of noblesse oblige is literally, but also but I think it's a very noble sort of instinct. But I do think that it's important to highlight the milieu from which Churchill came, and because that was so essential to his, I think Robert says, his extraordinary self-confidence, his ability to sort of shake off the mountains of criticism which he accreted over the course of his political career. And I suppose the dynasty, the Marlborough dynasty, yes, he didn't come from the main line, but I think that I think at the beginning, Robert says that no matter what, Churchill always had this sort of circle of aristocrats, which included his cousins from the upper branch of the family, to fall back into whenever he faced some troubles. And the 19th century tradition of the long weekend, which was the Friday to Monday sojourn at the various different great houses around England. I think this milieu was incredibly important to highlight. Yeah.
And then he calls out that there's this appeal, this almost Disraeli-like appeal to young England, calling Churchill throughout his career. I'm not so. I find that I can see in parts of it. They wanted that ruling class, but with progressive social reform. Roberts calls it exactly Disraeli combining imperialism abroad with a progressive program of social reform at home. I think to a certain extent you can agree with that, but I'm not sure that, if you were to do a parallel lives of Disraeli and Churchill, I'm not sure I would find much of an overlap, bar that statement is true. I think that what Disraeli was coming at and what Churchill, Disraeli was still, despite being seen as someone who, it depends actually who you're talking to sometimes, but Disraeli is seen as this wily maneuverer who will backstab his own position for power, sort of thing. But it's Churchill who crosses the floor. Now we can get to that, how Roberts frames that crossing the floor to the Liberal Party. But I actually think the worlds Disraeli inhabited and Churchill inhabited were quite different. Like young England had even died away by the time Disraeli was really pushing any what could be considered progressive program of social reform at home.
I think that
or do you think that you could get more? Yeah, go on.
No, I think that I agree that I don't think that there's too much of an overlap between Churchill's life and Disraeli's life. But I think Disraeli was sort of what inspired in Randolph Churchill the idea of Tory democracy. So the idea of the ruling class, almost like a patronizing, not in the negative sense, but in the positive sense, ruling class who does have this idea of noblesse oblige, but supports social reform. This was sort of the formulation of Tory democracy, which Randolph Churchill advocated. It was, I don't know how distinct it was from Benjamin Disraeli's idea, movement, Young England, or his political principles. But I don't think that, I think that Randolph Churchill and Benjamin Disraeli are much more comparable to one another in their political ideals than Winston Churchill and Benjamin Disraeli. But the key is that Winston Churchill was very much inspired by his father's idea of Tory democracy. While the sort of the ethos of the 19th century that surrounded Disraeli and Randolph, that was not able to follow Churchill throughout his political career. I think the principle of the ruling class sort of looking after the lower classes while still maintaining their superiority and dominance was not something that Churchill necessarily relinquished. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's some weird idiosyncrasies even to that Tory democracy, whereas like Randolph Churchill is quite favourable to home rule in Ireland, which again is something. It's a position Churchill starts taking almost out of there's certain other positions you see him taking almost out of what I don't know if it's just what he considered an inheritance from his father or a debt to his father or the need to live up to his father, that he ends up taking by trying to replicate him, he ends up taking on many of his idiosyncrasies. So for instance, despite wanting home rule for Ireland, Randolph Churchill then annexes Upper Burma, I believe when Parliament was in recess as well, and it was very dodgy.
It was very dodgy, yes.
Not above board whatsoever. And then you kind of see that again where you have the Churchill, Winston, that is, wanting a liberal version of. Well, he certainly wants passed the people's budget by 1909, but he's still clinging to elements of this noblesse oblige that we've talked about. So I think he almost inherits. By wanting to live up to his father, he inherits his idiosyncrasies and some of his faults as well, I would say.
Was home rule a fault? Is that one of the faults that you're referring to?
Well, I think of in terms of imperialist cohesion, yes, I would say yes. I'd be more inclined to think of, if you examine it, like the trajectory of a Joseph Chamberlain makes much more sense to me, where he enters a liberal because it's almost like Churchill's life in reverse, though he of course fades away, and it's the son Neville who was around at Churchill's moment of the trial and the hour.
Yeah.
But Joseph Chamberlain is the nephew of basically a rich screw manufacturer, and basically becomes a great organizer through private enterprise, and then enters politics and
is the mayor of Birmingham, right? Was he the mayor of Birmingham?
Yes, that's how he kind of latched onto his. And when he was mayor of Birmingham, he was known as a radical liberal because he effectively wanted more liberal policies. One, because he was he was a dissenter, so he came from the Unitarian Church. And also because I think he just wanted schools basically to be free of Anglican. Schools had to be taught through the Anglican tradition, and because he was a dissenter, he wanted against that. So he enters as liberal, but then when he gets to the home rule position, Chamberlain sees that when he gets to the upper echelons of government, and he's in Gladstone's cabinet at the time of the first home rule decision in 1886, he kind of backs away from it because he sees the instability of the whole situation and the preservation of the empire needing further cohesion rather than this sort of seeding out of power. Whereas Churchill is born into the palace, but then is kind of more happy to see parts of power be dissolved. I think ultimately, if you're thinking about the cohesion of the empire, then you see some of the issues that would have happened with home rule in Ireland anyway happening in a more modern setting today with Scotland, where anybody who got into that parliament would have again used it to undermine the situation. Like, I don't think it would have resolved the situation.
I agree. I do think that, the idea, I think the modern term is devolution, is it not, in the United Kingdom? That's the sort of the...
Yes, that's how it was all phrased in the late 90s, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that I agree that in terms of imperial cohesion, it was a mistake, and I think that Joseph Chamberlain was he left the cabinet, he abandoned Gladstone, did he not, and went to the Tories. Yes. Did he go to the Tories?
He forms his own party called the Liberal Unionists, which eventually become the holders of power in an election. So he's able to form a coalition with the Tories later.
Right, and then his son was a true Tory, was he not?
Yes, well, then that's how the Conservatives then become the Conservative and Unionist Party, because
Indeed.
they merge with the Liberal Unionists later. Yeah.
Right. So
So it is really around that issue of Ireland that you see someone like Chamberlain go from Liberal to Tory, whereas, and it's because of a Chamberlain policy on tariffs that you see Winston Churchill across the floor later in life. But I think maybe before we get to that, there's a bit more character building to do for Winston in the 1890s. So he is brought up in this milieu of the Home Rule, which I find interesting. What does it say? Roberts says that, he begins by talking about some of his earliest memories, and talks in 1882. Thomas Burke, the Undersecretary of Ireland, who had given Churchill a toy drum, was stabbed to death in Phoenix Park. So this is the Phoenix Park murders.
Churchill recounts that in his book, My Early Life. I remember he says his first memories are from Ireland. I think I have it here. When does one first begin to remember? When do the waving lights and shadows of dawning consciousness cast their print upon the mind of a child? My earliest memories are Ireland. He goes on to sort of recount his father's role in Ireland as the secretary to his father, the Duke of Marlborough, who was the Lord Lieutenant appointed by Mr. Disraeli in 1876. And I think the murder happened sometime later. I don't think Churchill stayed long in Ireland, but yes, the
murder happens in the 1882. Yeah,
1882, right? And I think this was, I guess, you talk about the irony of Chamberlain and the two Chamberlains and the differences and their effects on Churchill's family and his political decisions. But I think that another important fact is that Ireland itself, the question of Ireland, maybe, I don't know how relevant, I don't want to get into amateur psychology or anything, but the question of Ireland was, from the moment he was born, sort of implanted in him. And this was, you could argue that, I don't know, this was sort of...
And the same thing rears its head later in the 20s on India. It's the India question becomes basically an Ireland question plus for the whole empire. Which is quite interesting because he's formulated, and Chamberlain also took the same stance. I think that's why he was so harsh when he left Gladstone's cabinet in 1886. He could see that whatever decision was made in Ireland would eventually have knock-on effects for all of the other dominions in the empire, with everyone's eyes predominantly on India.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, well,
so it is interesting that you wonder how many of those young Irish memories are playing in Churchill's mind when he's quite obstinate on India actually later in life. It's still before the trial, it's going on in the 1920s when he refuses to give sort of an India Home Rule bill or to give his assent to it.
I think he was right about India, but wrong about Ireland. But yes, no, that is interesting.
I actually more or less agree with you on that. There's somewhere when we talk about his early life as well, there's some travels he makes which I think are quite important. I don't know if Roberts explicitly calls it out, but I think he's definitely hinting at this because he name drops it so much that 1883, when Churchill was 8, his father took him to Paris, and then later in 1895, before he actually goes to see any of the empire, I think he in 1893 he's gone through Harrow schooling and he passes this the Royal Military College, basically at the famous one at Sandhurst. He passes through it to be able to be stationed in the empire. But before he does that, he goes to New York, which is the city of his mother. And so there's these early travels to Paris and New York, which I actually think, again, sculpt his framework that he's going to develop later about his tendency towards certain alliances. He has youthful experiences in Paris. Obviously, his mother is American, and he has many trips to New York back and forth throughout his life. That when there's no mention of a trip here to Germany, there's no mention of exposure to Germany. It kind of does set it. You can see why he's beginning to set up with this idea. Well, I can affiliate myself more with the French here when it comes to the crunch later in life. I thought that was interesting. That wasn't explicitly called out, but when Roberts was name dropping these young travels, I felt it was being largely hinted at.
Right. Yeah. No, you're getting. Well, I alluded to this when I was sort of saying that, you know, Ireland may have had his early experiences in Ireland may have had a sculpting effect on his later framework, and I agree about France and America as well. I mean, you know, America. The thing with America is that his mother was American, so even, you know, irrespective of the travel that may have been inevitable. I don't know, but it may have been, because I think when he goes to America later on, and he meets a congressman who's a friend of his mother's and stays with him. This was all due to his mother. It wasn't due to any sort of. I think that the personal interest was derived from his mother. But I think it is important also to highlight those early travels and the potential. Sort of subliminal impacts that they had on the development of his character, and the three questions of the American alliance, the French alliance, and Ireland, and the Irish question. I think you could all see traces of them sort of developing in his childhood. Yes.
And is there anything about his schooling or his military service or his time in Bangalore in 1896 that you want to elaborate on? The only other thing I thought about was the schooling. Again, Roberts gives you this quite straight, though you know yourself, like, I think he gets into Harrow by doing some sort of recital on Aeneid Book 2, and he's learned, you know, he's forced to learn the Horatian Odes by heart, stay with him his whole life. So he latches himself back into that great 19th century classical learning. And I think this does help, you know, would have done many courses on rhetoric, and his oratorical skills all would have come from the schooling. But bar that, I don't have anything particular to take from these episodes.
From his schooling at Harrow, and then later his schooling at Sandhurst. Is that what, like, the whole thing? And then
that whole process,
and then his departure as a subaltern to Bangalore. Was that?
Yes. Well, of course, there is the
Cuba.
Lord Randolph's death.
Oh, Lord Randolph's death, and Cuba.
That happens before. Yeah, well, go on. What about Cuba? I don't have much on Cuba. What stood out for you on those passages?
Well, I think he went to Cuba to get experience, as I recall, because he realized that this was that he hadn't had any significant military experience, and I guess he thought that this would be able to propel him on to better and greater things. And so I think he used a family connection to go to Cuba and fight with the Spanish army against the natives there. And in those, I remember in his autobiography, at least, I remember him saying that he had a sort of, there he almost experienced a sort of sympathy towards the natives, and although he couldn't voice this in the midst of the Spanish army as he was, but this sympathy towards the Cuban rebels, which may again harken back to his or forward, I'd rather, to his thing on the Irish question. But what stood out for me was that this was his formative military experience. This is the first time that he heard shots in anger, and that he was forced to, march with an actual army. And he, again, one theme throughout his life, I think Roberts highlights it, is his propensity. It was not, I suppose, it's not an actual propensity, but his tendency to escape death, to escape very close shaves of death. And I think in Cuba he had a bullet whizzed by within an inch of him, and he had various experiences like this in many of the different conflicts in which he participated throughout his life. But this was his formative military experience in Cuba, where he. So I don't know. I just wanted to, point that out and highlight the developmental nature of that.
You see, that for me is suggestive of his character to want to go straight to the front line, but almost to do so without adherence to come up with common sense. Like what is he doing in that conflict?
Oh well, exactly. I mean, there was no particular. He didn't have a stake in it. He just wanted to go and get this experience. It was almost
It's almost an adrenaline junkie for the front lines of these sort of late imperial conflicts.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's the main importance of Cuba. But then Bangalore. What did you think of his time at Bangalore?
I didn't really have much to take from it. I was more interested, I think, around the same passages he was talking about. Again, the reading and the sculpting of his character. Did he take this reading list with him? I can't recall. But it's around the same passages as the Bangalore passages where Roberts talks about the large influence of Gibbon, which holds over him, and Macaulay. And Macaulay,
that was in Bangalore, yes.
Yeah, Macaulay's history of England is a very sort of progressive Whig account of history, where England ascends to its tradition in a straight line from the Glorious Revolution. Yes. That it's going to be...
It's the classic Whig history, isn't it?
It's the classic Whig history. Now, yeah, it's weird because sometimes Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome are quoted by people who also despise Whig history. So Macaulay, I think himself, is probably a misunderstood character. I would need to... I actually have his History of England here, but I would need to read it. I haven't read it. It's been on the shelf, basically.
Yeah, no, neither have I. But yes, the influence on Churchill was profound. In Bangalore, that was when he first began this sort of autodidacticism, which was another important feature. You talked about character building. Well, we talked about the various sort of subliminal, perhaps psychological experiences that he had. But I think autodidacticism, self-learning, is very important. I know that you're sort of very taken by this idea was it Sandhurst's history, when he was talking about Cardinal Wolsey and saying he was a ripe, good scholar, specifically pointing out not formal academic study, but self-learning. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you're talking there about John Edwin Sands' History of Classical Scholarship, which came out actually shortly after the period we're talking about. It was published in the Edwardian era over a course of 3 volumes. And yeah, he starts off by saying, when I talk about scholarship, he quotes Shakespeare's Henry VIII, who says, yeah, Cardinal Wolsey there was a scholar and a ripe, a good one, because Wolsey himself had come from nothing and had learned everything himself. So yes, it is something I always do like when someone, because for me it implies a genuine interest in what you're undertaking. If you're pursuing that yourself, you're going to have a much greater understanding of it, and 2, you're genuinely pursuing it out of your own interest, rather than you're not drifting through. Some people can be quite intelligent, but they're sort of drifted through life and the various institutions which have elevated them to a certain level.
Yeah. I mean, it's not I don't think it's necessarily a pox against formal education to say that there is something distinctly admirable in autodidacticism. And I think, so I suppose Churchill, despite, and Roberts likes to make the joke, and I suppose this joke can only truly be understood by Etonians when he says that, he couldn't have had any education because he went to Harrow or something of that. So that's why he had to self-educate.
Yeah, he always makes that joke in his interviews, and it's just the classic British schoolboy jibes that stay with people, I think, who've gone there for the rest of their lives. Like Harrow guys will have it against Etonians, and Etonians have their version against Harrow school children.
I think.
Well, I do like that, though, even though you're not a part of it. It's just nice to have that sort of ribaldry.
I agree. No, I don't think. I think I remember once reading something I think when Michael Gove first became the education secretary. I remember reading that he said that it was ghastly that the highest echelons of the Tory party were dominated by public school boys. But I don't think that that's ghastly at all. I think that that's actually a benefit to England. And I don't believe, I mean, I'm not against social mobility in any sense, but what I do think is that it is important to have this this class of people dominating the media and the politics of a country. They have done. I mean, ever since the ascendancy of meritocracy, England has fallen. I mean, it was the great aristocrats and the people that went to public schools that created the empire. And I think their record on the whole is nothing but greatness. Whereas I don't see the same post-war. There was the Thatcherites were fine. Blair was a bit of a Philistine. I just don't see. But anyway, that's besides the point. I wanted to.
You don't agree with Blair, Machiavellian genius?
Oh no, Blair is a Philistine, but he was a genius. He's a Machiavellian. I admire him for his political genius, just as I admire various other people with whom I don't agree with for their political geniuses. But Blair's, I think V.S. Naipaul said that Blair was leading a ghastly socialist revolution. I wouldn't quite go that far. Blair wasn't Corbyn, but I just see that his era was the final sort of the death knell of the dominance of the public school Tories, despite Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg nowadays. I just don't see that that's a bygone era. But Churchill. I think he failed to get into Sandhurst twice, and then he passed on the third time. And I think he in his book My Early Life, he says academically I was very poor. And Roberts, I think, sort of breaks apart this myth. He says, well, Churchill is actually representing himself to be rather more stupid than he actually was.
Self-deprecation.
Right. But what can't be denied is that Churchill certainly had academic difficulties, and it was why he couldn't go to. I think Randolph had initially, had this vision of his son going to Oxford or Cambridge, but Churchill could not. And so when he did go to Bangalore, finally back to the circle completes itself. We get back to Bangalore. In Bangalore, he did the reading list that he had. He took it upon himself to become educated in history and philosophy and in literature, in poetry. He read Macaulay. He read Gibbon. He devoured Gibbon. He said, I devoured Gibbon. And you can see the stylistic influences of Gibbon, and maybe slightly less pompously in Churchill's books. And I'm of the belief that Churchill and Gibbon are the two greatest prose stylists, and not to say writers, but prose stylists of the English language. But this was a critical period in Bangalore as a soldier, not only for, and it wasn't just the reading, it was, his perception of India, his view of the empire of the British Empire in a colonial territory up close. This was the first time he'd had that view since his very early childhood in Ireland, and India was totally a different context as well, the jewel in the crown of the empire. And so it was here in Bangalore that his fundamental character that you would see began to form. And I think that's very important. It was the autodidacticism as well as the perspective of the empire and how it functioned up close. And he saw the incompetence of various imperial generals and sort of the way I think he used his mother and her various trysts that she had with a number of different people to advance himself and to get himself to the front lines of a number of conflicts in India. But he saw sort of there was certainly a corruption, there was an incompetence, there was an ignorance, but he also saw what the empire could do for the people of India, what it could do for the colonies from his perspective. I suppose I suppose someone like Gandhi would have had a different perspective, but that was Churchill's. I think this was his most important formative period, the period at Bangalore.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I would have gone for where we're going next. Now again, it is formative, but then he finds himself. How does he actually find himself in the Sudan? Is he still a part of Sandhurst at that point? And then he's not a war correspondent yet, is he? Or is he under the capacity of a war correspondent?
I think he'd written he started writing for some of the papers while he was still in India, wasn't it? Because I think he went to Sudan after India. Yeah. At that point,
because that stood at the Sudan episode stood out for me as a much more formative experience in general. I suppose what you got to see in India was the day-to-day running, right? So it's a formative idea of how this thing is running day to day. And then the Omdurman, the Battle of Omdurman, which is basically Khartoum, it's just the other side of the river. This is his formative experience of like an imperial crisis, where you have this Mahdi rebellion where someone, I believe, genuinely thinks he's Muhammad reincarnated and sets up a fanatical breakaway state, I suppose, a theocratic state of some sort. Does he want to do a full-on jihad across all of Arabia? Though I don't think it would ever have had the legs to get outside of Sudan. Though maybe there was a fear it could spread up the Nile into Egypt. But basically, they're sent on a mission to avenge the failed escapade of General Gordon, who's beheaded on the steps of Khartoum. Right?
Yes, I believe that's what it was. But I wanted to point out that in India, Sudan wasn't the first. In India, it was the Malakand Field Force. That was, I don't know if that was a crisis, but it was an imperial military expedition in India when they sort of they were fighting, I think, the Mamand tribes, and or the tribes of the Mamand Valley who had inflicted certain losses on the British Army. So they went to get revenge, and they sort of cleaned out the valley. But that was, I don't know, that wasn't exactly a crisis, but he did have this military experience before Sudan. But then he got himself onto the Sudan expedition. And I would say that the Sudan expedition, the Battle of Omdurman was sort of, I think, I suppose we have this, a bit of disagreement on where the fundamental formative experience took place. I would say that Sudan was the apotheosis, the culmination of his formation. But I wouldn't say it was the meat of it, but it was the culmination of it. But anyway, sorry, carry on. I just wanted to interject there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to have these sort of. It's funny how I just sort of, I was going back over them, and I hadn't taken the same interest in the Bangalore chapters other than the autodidacticism. But it's that's why it's interesting to flesh it out with a different voice, a different perspective on someone who's read this. But I went straight to this quote on in the chapter Ambition Under Fire, which ends in July 1898, and Roberts quotes Churchill that he says, quote, "I shall devote my life to the preservation of this great empire and to trying to maintain the progress of the English people." He wrote in the same December, he's quoting a December 1897 letter. "Nor shall anyone be able to say that vulgar consideration of personal safety ever influenced me." And then he concludes with, "Cowardice in battle was vulgar."
Yes.
So it is really, it's the last cavalry charge of, I think Roberts points out, it's sometimes known and quoted as the last cavalry charge of the British Empire. This cavalry charge, it's conducted by Lord Kitchener as well, who springs to fame in his own.
It's known as the last cavalry. I don't think it actually was the last cavalry.
Yeah, Roberts points out that there are some minor ones later. Or Roberts
in the First World War.
As a historian,
machine guns of Germany. Yeah.
As a historian, Roberts is a pains to sort of point out, well, actually, that the actually mean that it's not actually the last cavalry charge, but it is the last significant one, really. And it's interesting that that Churchill's present with Kitchener, because you talked about the role Eton had to play. I remember one of the books I read years ago that kind of helped my framing around a lot of the imperial positions was this book by Kwasi Kwarteng, who is a Tory MP. I think his parents are from Ghanaian descent. And he entered Eton on a scholarship, a King's scholarship, which basically means...
Just like Boris, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Kwarteng, as far as I'm aware, came from extremely humble backgrounds, and his parents being Ghanaian immigrants who settled up north in Newcastle, I think, and then basically gets his King's scholarship. But then his whole milieu then is in this Etonian mold. So then when he comes out with this book, Ghosts of Empire, and I think it has like 6 different episodes in it. One is the annexation of Burma, which was my first exposure to Randolph Churchill, and then the other one is he does this great sort of mini biopic on Kitchener, and with the main episode of that being the Sudan. And I thought, this is quite interesting that that Churchill's there with Kitchener. I think it's Kitchener who goes onto the posters of the Great War, that your country needs you.
He hated Kitchener.
Yeah, they would. Yeah, and that's why I think it's we can flesh that out later, where Kitchener will be in charge of the army and Churchill will be in a position of in charge of the admiralty. So there is, both keen strategists, though Kitchener far more ultimately the army man and Churchill becoming far more the politician, even though I think that would probably grate with Churchill. But yeah, it's interesting that they both were present at this scene, and they both later go on to be at loggerheads at such a critical moment in the Great War.
Yes, well, there was a specific difficulty, I think, in Churchill's getting to the Sudan crisis at all. I think he asked for permission from he asked for permission, and I think Herbert Kitchener actually said that he did not, that he refused Churchill's application to join the Egyptian army. And I don't know, I think at this point he may have been a correspondent, but I think he started being a correspondent when he was with the Malakand Field Force. So I think maybe it was Kitchener's disapprobation of correspondence. And
yeah, you wouldn't know what sort of reports would be going home, because of course the image of what had happened in Gordon's disgrace, or the disgrace of the British for not sending relief to Gordon, who was basically trapped in Khartoum for weeks, and everyone knew that he was encircled, and Parliament stalled too long to be able to send a rescue force, basically. So perhaps it was out of that whole kerfuffle that Kitchener was very aware of anyone who was there under reporting capacity could quickly change the narrative back in London.
Indeed, and Churchill had already begun to make a name for himself as this sort of adventurous, this sort of strapping, adventurous, obscure son of the Marlborough dynasty who was sort of hopping about the colonies looking for glory, I think. And so
yeah, like I can 100% understand where Kitchener's coming from. It's like, this guy, no, he's popping up everywhere. I don't know what he's got to take from this. I'd rather he just doesn't see.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I can understand where Kitchener comes from.
He got in anyway, I guess. But the cavalry charge itself, did you find anything significant in the actual physical events of the cavalry charge, or do you want to say anything more?
It's as far as I'm aware, it's a rout. Fairly comfortably dispatched. It's more the symbology of it, really. It's the avenging of Gordon. It's the showing that it was actually a sort of stagnation on the home front, and the gears of Parliament, which had created the position in the first place, and that it was men on the again, Churchill always wanted to be on the battlefield, the front line at this point in his life. That was seen to get things done. It's an interesting episode in Britain's imperial past that I think sometimes gets overlooked. But yeah, in terms of if you're talking about pure military strategy or something, as far as I'm aware, it's a complete rout. And
what do you think, I suppose, to cap off this episode, what do you think was the fundamental formative effect? Because you said you thought this was his most. What do you think was the fundamental formative effect on Churchill, or on his psyche, or whatever?
The romance of what the empire could be, like this heroic avenging mission on Gordon. The Mahdi revolution represents fanaticism and the sort of crazy old world, you could say, like old as in this man could have come out from 7th century Arabia, this guy who thought he was Muhammad reincarnated. This old world which seemed so distant and remote, both temporally and then also geographically from London, that he saw that it was the empire that could bring a civility to these lands, and also the whole romance of the charge and the romance of what military duty could bring to the empire as well. Like all of that concocting together is why I would prescribe as a formative
the empire, as it were, sweeping off the last the final skeletal grip of fanaticism.
Yeah, and he mentions before this he's kind of led Churchill in as Roberts, because he's like, he loves Gibbon, and of course Gibbon in his History of the Roman Empire is very skeptical of Christianity, which is for a whole reason of Gibbon's personal life, which we don't need to get into. But he pinpoints the inculcation of a sort of, Gibbon portrays in his Decline and Fall first sort of Christian fanaticism which infects Rome, and then of course in the later volumes he does bring in the Mohammedanism and that own sect of fanaticism. So it's filled with these sort of almost anti-religious pieces. And I think at one point Roberts does take pains to say there's nothing really saying that Churchill believed in Jesus Christ or had a. He was. Yeah.
I mean, essentially an agnostic. I mean, I don't know if you could exactly call him an atheist, but he was. I guess I think his fundamental ethos was essentially atheistic. I guess that's how I would phrase it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he leaves. You could call it agnostic because it's never explicitly stated. So there is always that.
I don't think he ever came to a definite conclusion, but Now, I think one thing was that the desecration of the Mahdi's tomb, right after the battle, when the British Army desecrated the Mahdi's tomb, this was something that Churchill hated that happened. He hated Kitchener for having allowed it to happen, and Kitchener kept the Mahdi's skull. And it was, I think, some people said he might use it as a drinking vessel or something like that, an inkwell. But I think Churchill. He saw the empire's potential civilizing influence sweeping away the last vestiges of fanaticism, but he also saw in the sort of the raucous triumphalism at the end of the battle the less salubrious excesses of the empire, and this caricature of Churchill is this gung-ho, jingoistic imperial character who just sort of goes around, waving the imperial flag and stomping on the peoples of different colonies is belied by this moment of sympathy. Even after the battle, he could not tolerate. It wasn't just a minor irritation. It was he felt sort of a virulent anger, or a violent anger rather, at this desecration. And I don't know. I don't think it wasn't enough to break his imperial, by any means, his imperial ideals, but I think Churchill was aware of, some of what. Maybe you can see echoes of that in his support of Home Rule. I don't know, but yeah.
I think that it's an interesting dual reaction there. The one, because both are kind of romantic in their own image. The one of Kitchener with the skull, though maybe romantic's the wrong word, but it's sort of there's a mythological embellishment to it. But there's also, I would say, Churchill more has sort of a medieval chivalric notion in his romanticism, right, and the reaction to this battle. Whereas Kitchener, it's kind of, I would, having not been there, I think Kitchener has this groundedness to him. He has this lived, it's quite a leftist term, the lived experience. The lived experience of Kitchener in the army on the front lines. Like, he's been fighting these sort of people. He knows the messages needed to be sent out. Right. And I think that's always, it's quite an interesting dual reaction. Exactly. Even, like, I'm not sure, I think I would allow, if Kitchener is in the position of the authority, I would allow him to do it at that point, because these people have beheaded Gordon on the steps. I think they've sown their seeds in that regard.
To an extent, I wouldn't say that. I don't think the reaction was justified because it was a historical monument. That's all. I don't think it's about the people. It's about the historical monument. But I can see Kitchener's mentality. I think that. I'll grant it. I'll grant it to some of the, the critics of empire when they say, this idea, you pointed it out quite excellently there, that Churchill's romantic idea of the empire was not, it did not always coincide with the reality of events. I mean, not to say, the empire was, I think, a great benefit on the whole, but this romantic idea of the chivalric empire did not really coincide with the actual turn of with the actual events that took place. I think I don't know. I wasn't able to interpret your remark on Forster when you said that he was. Do you like Forster? Do you dislike Forster?
No, I ultimately like Forster, but yeah, it's pure recessional. It's there's a whole melancholy tone throughout the whole thing, which like I would prefer a Forster than an Evelyn Waugh reaction of around, like, to put it around the same time.
Oh yeah, I think. I mean, Evelyn Waugh was more. He was less about the empire, more about the aristocracy, wasn't he? I mean, I suppose.
Yeah, but they're both sort of encapsulating this recessional decline in my own. But with Waugh, it's far more decadent.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I actually prefer Waugh, oddly enough, but I
yeah. I find Brideshead Revisited difficult enough to. It's just so decadent some parts.
Well, and I thought it was, well, yes, it is. That's the truth of it. But I think that Forster, what he encapsulates, I think I think Forster's psychology was magnificent because he sort of encapsulated. I don't want to, but he sort of encapsulated to an extent, maybe, and maybe he exaggerated it, but he encapsulated to an extent what the actual imperial psychology was like on the ground. I think there's a character. There is the character Hamidawa, who's a sort of he's an Indian Muslim in the book. He says, well, friendship with an Englishman is possible in England, because I think he went to Cambridge. He said, as a barrister, he said it's possible in England, but it isn't possible in India. And I think the point he emphasizes was that, and the sort of they talk about how when the English people when they first come, they're perfectly polite, like the new colonialists. When they first come, they're perfectly polite, but then once they sort of get set in the habits of colonialists, they sort of develop this sort of I don't know, this contempt for the natives, despite the fact that their mission may indeed benefit the natives on the whole. And so that element of imperial psychology, I think that dichotomy between Churchill's romanticism, and Churchill, because he was never actually a colonialist, he spent time in the colonies, but he wasn't someone who went there and lived there. I think Churchill was never able to feel the same sort of contempt that a character like Kitchener might have felt, having had that experience,
Yeah, and I think that's a very astute observation. We should then go on, I think, because we fleshed that out. I think that's quite good. Like, you emerge from that Sudan episode with the Kitchener Churchill dichotomy almost. I think that's an interesting way of viewing that event.
Yeah.
It was in 1898. It was around the same time that he stands in a by-election and loses. But it shows you that he's getting interested. He wants to actually be in Parliament at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Boer War is the next major incident.
Yes. Oh, yes. The Boer War is quite important as well. So it's past 50 minutes. Do you want to? But you want to continue with the Boer War, yes?
Oh yeah, we'll definitely go up until at least the breakout of the Great War.
Okay. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah. So we got another half hour at least, I think. At most,
so, yeah. So what were your thoughts on the Boer War and what? So just.
The Boer War is another very interesting episode, and I actually there's a book on it I mean to read, but I haven't read yet, which I think is Pakenham's Boer War. It seems to be the one to go to. Pakenham wrote two books which you see in sort of general bookshops today. One is The Scramble for Africa, which more broadly looks at the whole European experience, and then he wrote a particular one on the Boer War. So the Boer War lasts from 1899 to 1902, but it's really the normal battle part of that only lasts a year, less than a year. But the last two parts of that is basically the descent of the war into tribal warfare, or what's the term? Guerrilla warfare by part of the Boers, where they know the land and they can just stake out in rural locations and then have sort of small unit targets, even though Britain has already won all of the, it's conquered all of the major cities and all of the major hubs needed to secure the war. there's no signing of a peace, basically. So it descends into what can be considered very cruel conditions. And this is where Kitchener is also sent to be in charge of it eventually, and where Britain often gets lambasted for quote creating the concentration camp, close quote, in this.
And Roberts does debunk that idea that, I mean, the Boer quote unquote concentration camps were really I mean, the conditions there were not good. No one says that they were, but they weren't willfully. I don't think that they were sort of imposed by the British in a way to punish the Boers. They were sort of like almost like holding pens, I guess. I mean, that sounds very inhumane, but holding centers for these some of these people who had been what was it? I don't know if I can finish the statement. I actually who didn't.
Are you afraid to finish the statement, or are you just not sure on the facts here?
No. I don't want to make a factually incorrect statement. Yes, I'm going to.
Okay. Well, basically,
I don't remember the situation. The reason that I didn't finish the statement, I don't remember the exact situation of the people who were brought to these camps. What I do remember is that these were not camps set up to punish the Boer people. That's all I'm going to say.
And it's around the same time that Roberts he delves a bit into some of these novels Churchill was publishing around the same time. So The River War comes out as a result from an historical account of the reconquest of the Sudan. I've never seen this in a bookshop or anything. It's funny, we talked about the similarities to Disraeli. You can still go into a bookshop and find a copy of Disraeli's Sybil, or that's the one you can kind of find again online. Like, I've managed to source a Coningsby, but I've sourced that online. I've never really seen that in a shop. But a Churchill novel like The River War, I've never seen that in anywhere. Or there's another one that comes out later called Savrola. I've never seen it.
Yeah, I know.
Very rarely talked about.
Sorry, was The River War a novel, or was it?
It's a historical account of but it's looking at the passages. Roberts quotes. It's a very sort of flourishingly embellished historical account. Quote, the malodorous incense of civilization offered to the startled gods of Egypt. You can almost like picture T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, right? That sort of flavor.
Yes. But I think that Savrola was written shortly after the Malakand field. Shortly after Churchill had written the story of the Malakand field force, which was his first imperial venture in India. But I think that the significance of Savrola is highlighted by Roberts earlier on. He quotes passages at length from Savrola, does he not, where he describes the character, which is almost a Churchillian character. It's similar to
this is why it is similar to Disraeli. Is like you insert yourself and you insert ideas of that are circulating around the political currents of the time into a novel format. It was more done in Disraeli's time, but again, Churchill aspiring back to that kind of seems to want to be able to do that sort of thing.
But doesn't he writes about a European war, does he not? Was it Savrola where he wrote about a European war and about fighting against the Russians, and about how he would, the main character is on a horse and he nearly gets shot, and all of these things actually happened to Churchill in his life. I think this was the point. This is why Savrola is important, although it's not seen as significant nowadays. I think Andrew Roberts brings to light the importance of Savrola in highlighting Churchill's prescience and his sense of himself.
It's interesting in that, though, that he takes on the Russians as the enemy, because again, that makes more sense in terms with if you're to chime in with a quote he has from the River War here. It says, individual Muslims may show splendid qualities, but the influence of the religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world, And again, it's what you have there is Gibbon twinned with Macaulay. You have the progressivism of Macaulay twinned with the anti-religious stance of Gibbon. But if you're looking at it on the European sphere in the Second World War, again, the Tsarist autocracy would be the first thing in my mind that would evoke the same sentiment. So it's interesting then that he makes the Russians the enemy in his novel. So like in his perceived idea of this European conflagration, he would have had it so that he was almost against the Russians, which is interesting because on both occasions, like he even teams up with a beast of a completely different nature with the Soviet Union, but it's still like teaming up with the Russians. That's quite interesting.
It is, but against a much worse. Well, didn't Churchill say, "I'd rather be ruled by the Soviets than the Nazis"? I think he said that, didn't he?
Well, he would probably have had to have said it at one point to justify the alliance he made.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess that depends on who you are, but on a generalized basis, I don't know. I'm not in that period. I can't actually say if I agree or not. But anyway.
Yeah, well, we can get back to the Second World War in a later edition. But
the
Boer War, basically, Churchill ends up as war correspondent again. He ends up being imprisoned, and he has this sort of escape. And again, I think a lot of it's shrouded in a bit of, is it embellished, or like how much was this captivity held by the Boers? How how highly guarded was he? I'm not sure.
He wasn't. Well, he was brought to a complex which wasn't originally a prison. I think it was a school complex, was it not? Something like that. I think. But he was brought, and they weren't mistreated. That's one thing to point out. He was in prison, but he wasn't mistreated. And in fact, in prison, I think he actually sent for a barber to cut his hair. So I mean, if they were allowing prisoners to send for barbers, I imagine that it wasn't.
He was having a better time than a COVID lockdown if he could get a barber.
Yeah, I guess so. But he wasn't. Okay, so I don't think he was guarded extremely strictly, but it also wasn't. I don't think it was. Well, I guess that depends on individual.
Like, does he just decide one day, right, I've had enough of this, I'm off, and he just leaves?
No, sorry, they made a pact, didn't they, him and a bunch of other prisoners, about escaping, and I think in the end Churchill sort of climbed over one of the walls to get to the outside, and he was waiting for the others, but the others ended up not showing, so he ended up having to go off by himself and sort of wander through the landscapes of South Africa until he found a train to attach himself to. And then I think eventually he managed to find a British colonist in like totally out of the middle of nowhere. It could have been a Boer who would have alerted the Boer army, but no, it was a British settler who hid him in a mine. And in the mine, he describes this disgusting experience. Roberts mentioned it, but it's described more harrowingly in Churchill's first book when he says that he is sleeping in this mine and he has to stay there for several days while the British colonists that live in the area have to find arrangements for him to get out, to escape. And he's just sort of at night, whenever he turns off the lamp, or whenever the lamp goes out, it's not electronic. So whenever the lamp goes out or he blows it out, he feels rats crawling all over him, and he has to sort of sleep in this environment for several days. And eventually he's brought out of the mine and sent on a train where he's able to return to safe territory. But to your question, he wasn't very strictly guarded, but this escape is what really propelled him to fame in Britain, was it not?
Yeah, because I was about to say, this is because he's already stood for by-election and failed. But I really think it is because of this sort of tale. Probably does enough to push him over the line, right? In some sort of local election, he's gained a bit of. It's not notoriety. I suppose it's fame. The war has had a bad impact largely on Britain, but here comes this story of sort of a brave escape, and I think that gets latched onto by certain elements of the public.
This was a psychological reprieve for many of the people of Britain who. Now, again, I return to Forster briefly to say that he says that, most of the time, people don't feel anything. They're just sort of not excited or depressed, something of that sort. So I don't know, when you say that, when historians say the people, I don't fully agree with it, but I also sympathize with it to an extent, because the people of Britain were in this horrible psychological state because of losses in South Africa, which is several thousands of miles away from. I'm not sure how much the average person would have actually felt this sort of sentiment of this sense rather of the modern world closing in upon him or anything like that. But it still was a psychological reprieve, I think, at least to an extent, Churchill's escape in the general public. And it was a glorious tale of pluck and intelligence, and so Churchill writing of this account, and of course other people writing about him in the papers, is what allowed his name to fully enter the consciousness of the public, and it's what kickstarted his career in politics, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe my call out of the people there was akin to when Carlyle describes Marat in the French Revolution, of constantly badgering on about, the le peuple. It's like, mate, you wouldn't know the people outside, like shooting over the head, sort of thing. Right. Marat constantly trying to latch onto this abstract, very particular idea of the people that he has. Maybe it was at fault there for doing something similar.
Yes.
I suppose so we're in like sort of the period 1900 to 1905, which culminates in the crossing of the floor at the 1905-1906 election, which eventually becomes a Liberal landslide. So he is about 5 years with the Tories in the House of Commons.
For his political development, I mean, do you want to get into his liberalism, like Churchill's political liberalism, that is with a capital L, and then his sort of his switch from the Tory mentality to the liberal mentality? I mean, do you think that
there's enough time to get into it? Yeah, I think we should add that here, because it's
this is extremely important, is it not?
Yeah, and again, I'm kind of with Chamberlain on the 1905 election, but again, it wouldn't fly with the people, because and this time I do mean the people, I mean the electorate, because Chamberlain, Joseph, at this point, who was largely responsible for the Boer War, it's called Joe's War. As colonial secretary, he helped basically begin it as an idea to try and unionize Africa, because his whole idea, or South Africa, because his whole idea was to unionize and consolidate as much of the empire as possible. He even, like, his ultimate dream was basically an imperial parliament.
Yes,
that would meet like once a year or something.
That's fascinating. Were there not MPs who represented British India? Was that Was that not the case? No, maybe not.
No, I don't think so. But you saw bits of this when they elected, the Tories elected Bannerlaw as leader later, basically a Canadian, to try and push this sort of thing as well. Yeah. But it never. The failure of Chamberlain in the 1905 election really does mark an end to, I think, the idea as something which could be realizable, because it twinned with him. There is a mooted alliance with Germany now. The Entente Cordiale, I think, is signed with France in 1904. So by the time this election has happened, the alliances are already starting to shake up a little bit. Yes. But the whole point of the 1905 election, I think the campaign starts in 1905, but I think it's technically January 1906 is when it comes in. Ends up with a Liberal landslide, but it's all about tariff reform, where Joseph Chamberlain wants tariffs placed on non-imperial goods, but goods still coming from within the empire will have basically free trade. So it's seen as an imperial consolidation. He's basically saw it as a larger scale version of what the Germans had already done in their sort of Zollverein. That something from Bavaria could travel into Prussia within the German Empire, even though there was still a Prince of Bavaria who would have been a king, but 20 years earlier. He saw that sort of consolidation that was happening in Germany, and he felt it could happen on a larger transatlantic and Pacific British imperial framework.
So
But
sorry to clarify, had there been tariff had tariff policy been beforehand that there were tariffs within the empire? I'm not certain.
No, there was no. I don't think there's any distinction made between what came in from imperial domain, or, the domains or not domains, but also Britain had steadfastly not put up tariffs at all.
They hadn't since the Corn Laws. That was the policy, right?
Where other countries had, but since the 1870s, there'd been a continuing rise. At the United States, I think even France, Germany definitely had all put up tariffs, and it had actually benefited the German. It had been seen to have benefited the German state in the preceding decades. Mm-hmm. Britain, because of the whole Corn Law inheritance, where its own great expanse happened in the 1850s, 1860s. In the minds of the political class, that great expanse it was twinned with laissez-faire economics, and hence there was still a reluctance to impose any sort of tariffs, even on an imperial-wide framework. Which, if you had done it, but basically what happens is it collapses with the electorate, because the liberals are able to go, your shoes are going to be dear. Everything in your daily life is going to be dear if these guys get in and impose this tariff. Mm-hmm. And Churchill has laissez-faire leanings. Again, does that come from Randolph? Would you say
Randolph was? I'm not.
Or where does this inner liberalism, come from in Winston?
I know that. Okay. So first of all, what was Disraeli's opinion on? I mean, Disraeli was a free trade.
Disraeli wanted to preserve the Corn Laws, and then later switched. It's basically seen as one of the Disraeli switches, which makes him sort of duplicitous in the minds of many. And again, this is you can have a similar question right here about Churchill. Does he switch because he smells they're going to lose the election, or does he switch because he has this ingrained liberal streak, which he feels the Tories are turning their back on here?
Well,
and that's the two ways to perceive the event.
I think his shift from Toryism to liberalism was, it actually goes back to Bangalore. He started reading, I think at this time, Hansard and various other books about, Hansard is a record, but Hansard as well as books about policy, economic policy during his father's time. He comes to the conclusion, and this is about social reform, but he comes to the conclusion that, I see that, the Tories, he'd always, he'd have this sort of caricatured view of what Toryism was as a child. He believed that any help, although his father actually did believe in noblesse oblige, Churchill, I guess, had this idea that any sort of social programs to help the lower orders were socialist. And he comes out of his reading saying, okay, I see how Toryism and these reforms can be reconciled to each other. This is the start of his support for social programs. This sort of expands, and then I don't know if you can exactly tie that in. I do think that he. I'm not sure if he in that time, if his economic views on tariffs his views on tariffs were formed, but I don't think that he was ever against tariffs. Like, I don't think he had a clear position on them beforehand, which was specifically opposed to them. I think he came to the idea. I think he was always generally positively predisposed to tariffs. I don't think there was any radical psychological reset. But his shift to liberalism generally did oddly enough come from his initial formulation of Tory democracy. And I think Robert said that he doesn't ever actually retreat from Tory democracy throughout his career, no matter which party he was on. But on the issue of tariffs, no, I don't. I mean, the Tory party had been essentially, it was initially a Tory shift, was it not? Robert Peel that shifted the party to tariffs. So it isn't as if tariffs were synonymous with Gladstone's party by the end of the 19th century. So I think it was more a matter of principle for Winston.
Because I'm leaning on expediency myself. Having even read Roberts, I think he smelt this was going to be a landslide, and I'm still young, and I want to be, because there's very little personality overlap between himself and Lloyd George, and I think it's even stated later that Lloyd George viewed Churchill's alliance with pure expediency as well.
He didn't really like Churchill personally, but they became. But superficially, at least, they were friends. I mean, I don't think Churchill was ever aware that Lloyd George disliked him. Or no.
Churchill sort of wandering through life, is it?
Throughout his early years, I think towards the end of the First World War, he began to become aware of Lloyd George's, and maybe Roberts mentioned it, but in the beginning he wasn't. But yes, his switch was viewed. Okay, I'll say this: I don't think that that expediency was a consideration. Was not a consideration. That is, I think that he did. That I think electoral calculus was on his mind, but I don't think that it was the prime influencing factor, because if you remember, he enters the Tory party as a young MP, and he's immediately already he allies himself with a rather obscure, not obscure, but a young sort of group of Tory MPs who don't adhere to the party line already from the beginning. Now, you could say this is just him being a contrarian because he likes to be a contrarian, but it seems like he was already opposed to what, and he made various speeches that were against the government in increasing rancor throughout his time as a Tory MP, to the point where he was just driven to. It was not only electoral calculus, and it was not only political economic principles. It was also personal hatred for the front bench of the Tory party, that he just developed this bitter relationship with the Tories generally on a personal level because of what he'd done. And so
again, there seems to be that dual track. There's the Chamberlain positions and there's the Churchill positions that seem to straddle generations.
Yeah.
Because even here on the chapter Crossing the Floor, Joseph Chamberlain's son Austin, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, said that Churchill's conversion to radicalism had coincided with his personal interests. And so again, it's like that feels, I know it's just a tiny bit of a quote taken out of context, but it just feels personal. It's like Austin is inheriting his father's position, but it's like it's biting at the person almost more for the switch. It just feels like there's a bitterness developing in terms of character where they're almost bound to find themselves on opposing sides on key policy decisions.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know then if this is a good point to call it. So basically, in 1906, there is the Liberal landslide, and Balfour, as we see, Balfour finally resigns on the 4th of December 1905, and this is the preceding months was when Churchill would have smelt that he felt that this was going towards a Liberal landslide. Whereupon the King sent for Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, the Liberal leader of the opposition, who formerly formed a minority caretaker government with sole aim of calling election, which he did in January 1906.
Yeah.
And then I think there's enough in the People's Budget, which is the next major piece I have around 1909, that I don't want to sort of rush it. So I think this might be a good place to call it.
Okay. Yeah.
Where Churchill will develop his what Roberts begins to call the liberal imperialist position, and I think maybe we can just round off on this concept of liberal imperialist. I think there's two things I think about when I think about a liberal imperialist. One is I think it did elongate the longevity of the empire by the formulation of these sort of characters, but ultimately it sowed the seeds of its inevitable destruction within, say, like 100-year mark, within a generation of liberal imperialists, it would go, sort of thing. So because you've undercut it.
Sorry, the policy. So which I suppose which liberal imperialist, I don't know, which were the most crucial policies you think that led to the liberal of liberal imperialism that sowed the seeds?
Well, we'll get to it with the People's Budget, but it's basically this destruction of the House of Lords and its ability to veto the Commons in 1909, 1910. And then that election, because of the whole veto issue, right? I'll lay it out right now. So the People's Budget is basically the beginning of a welfare state in Britain,
It
and
is.
it was seen to be so radical that there was the classic, how are we going to spend for this? How are we going to account for this in the coffers as well as the maintenance of the empire? So you have that dichotomy, and you also have this idea where the House of Lords always had the ability to veto bills coming from the Commons. But there was an unwritten rule that they would never veto something that was basically meant for the exchequer. If it was coming from the exchequer, it wouldn't be something the Lords deemed that they would revolt. But because they felt eventually that this thing, and there's a whole battle, this thing trying to get through. Again, I think it's more Lloyd George's vision, and Roberts calls out Churchill on this, where he says he doesn't seem to believe or understand that his policies are undermining his imperialist. So his imperialist position is being undermined by this people's budget.
Mm.
So let me try and find let me see if I can find the quote. But while I'm trying to find it, yes, I don't know if you have anything to say on this. Basically, the way the elections happen then, because there's a whole position on should the Lord's veto be gotten rid of, there's another election called in 1910. This then
the Lords
basically leaves the Tories with the same position as the Liberals. So then the Liberals, to gain power, need to go into a coalition with the Irish Home Rule Party.
Yes, indeed,
and that then sows the seeds for the dissolution of the Irish question, which we can get to later because it coincides with the Great War. But by the time that 1910 coalition has come into action, and there's a 1911 Parliament bill which basically eventually removes this Lord's veto, which means they cannot veto the Irish Home Rule Bill anymore because it'll pass a third time. And there's this whole thing like the Lords will not shut down the same bill 3 times, and they'd already done this one twice. So then you're left with the classic Irish dissolution question. Yeah,
Lords who wanted, I mean, there were there not Lords at the time who did sort of want to push the authority of their house onto the Commons, but I think that they realized, the more practical members realized that if they did this, it would be a constitutional crisis. Was that not the case?
That was the case, but I actually put the blame at Lloyd George and the Liberals because the people's budget was so radical that it basically disintegrated the working function, which had because England has no written constitution. There was a lot of unwritten rules between just how imposing the Lords would ever be, and by pushing through this extraordinary budget at the height of empire, it basically ground the functionality of how the Commons and Lords talked to each other on a political level. It ground that to a halt. And I think that led to a real sense of crisis going into the Great War, which is kind of why Ireland's allowed to slip away. It's one of the reasons why. But so the budget itself, though, is kind of an inevitable place where the Liberal Party was always going to go. So that's why I think liberal imperialism is sort of an oxymoronic position, and it's doomed to fail. Even though the existence of liberal imperialists kind of kept the empire going for a generation, because at least all the Liberal Party didn't immediately want the dissolution, right? So think about it, like there was never a Labour imperialist, right? So.
No. Do you think that? But do you think that the empire, if the liberal imperialist position had not become the prevailing one, do you think that the empire would have collapsed earlier under the
under a purely liberal
under its
position,
own?
It would have.
Sorry, if the Tories had been in power, do you think that it would have collapsed under its own weight? Is what I'm saying.
No, not in that generation. Certainly not. No, I think basically tariff reform in 1906, 0506 would have been the way to go. I don't know how you'd spin it that the electorate would have ever voted for it, but if you'd spun that, consolidate the empire and push towards the imperial parliament positions. That can overcome difficulties then that exist between the commons and the lords.
Parliament sounds. I mean, I respect Chamberlain's. It was Chamberlain's formulation, but I just feel like it sounds a bit, quixotic. I mean, it just sounds like it's fanciful, I suppose. An imperial parliament. I'm not against the idea, but it doesn't sound like that could ever really. There would just be too many. It's just like a conflict of interest. Like, it just sounds like a huge boiling pot of conflict of interest that would totally dissolve in tears and recriminations, and I don't know,
Yeah, but he was looking at the example of Germany, I think, and people would have said for Germany for ages that was impossible. And of course, there is idiosyncrasies which occur with German unification. For instance, Bismarck was astute enough to know he had to kick Austria out of it, and so on.
Yes.
So there, perhaps if it ever did come to pass, like that there was an imperial parliament, perhaps someone would need to be kicked. You don't know how it would have manifested. Some parts may have been able to consolidate, while other parts may have had been kicked out. But ultimately, I think it was better than this course which happened, which was the liberal landslide, and then this people's budget, which dislocated the whole functionality of the lords, and then it just leads it makes Ireland this complete basket case, and we can get into this in the next episode when
we should and into the specifics of it. Do you want to talk about the specifics of the economic policies of the people's budget as well and everything?
No, I think we can open the next one. That basically the trajectory of our next one can start with the way the people's budget led into Ireland almost ending in a state of civil war, and would have probably gone to civil war,
right,
if not for the outbreak of the Great War.
And then what about the welfare state angle? Is that something you'd like to cover it,
if you want to cover it, I think we can do it. Again, I think, let's cover it then.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I don't want to go into so much detail on it, but yes, it's something. And I don't want to draw any sort of set conclusions on what that meant. I don't want.
But Churchill's position with this budget, and I see Churchill getting ultimately moving across the floor for expediency, and then getting largely swept up by a more astute politician at that time, Lloyd George.
Right. Yes. I don't. Well, I think the expediency was only one angle of it. I think actually the principal issue was personal hatred of the members of the Tory party more than
sure.
More than that, but I don't think that principle is an irrelevant question. But anyway, yes, that seems to be where we'll leave off for today.
All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed that. I thought it was an interesting discussion. We fleshed out a lot. Any main takeaways? I like the way we came out with the Kitchener-Churchill dualism out of 1898 Sudan experience. I thought that was a good one.
that was a good one. Yeah. No, it was a great pleasure. So until the next time, I suppose. À la prochaine. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, guys. Till then.